My name is Lisa Brown. I'm 62 years old, and my 3 adult children left me stranded at Penn Station on Christmas Eve, with nothing but a suitcase and a one-way ticket back to nowhere. They drove away in the Mercedes I helped them buy, wearing the designer coats I gifted them last year, leaving me standing in the freezing December wind like I was some stranger they'd given charity to. But here's what they didn't know as they celebrated their decision to finally cut me loose. I wasn't just their mother, I was their financial lifeline, and I was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd be the kind of mother who'd weaponize money against her own children, but then again, I never thought my children would be the kind of people who'd abandon their mother on the most sacred night of the year. The irony wasn't lost on me as I dragged my wheeled suitcase across the grimy station floor, dodging hurried commuters and holiday travelers. For 35 years I'd been their safety net, their emergency fund, their silent partner in every major life decision. They'd grown so accustomed to my financial support that they'd forgotten it wasn't an entitlement, it was a gift that could be revoked. The whole nightmare started 3 months earlier, when I made what I thought was a reasonable request. I was getting older, my arthritis was making it harder to maintain the 4-bedroom house in Westchester that I'd bought specifically so my children would always have a place to come home to. And I suggested we spend Christmas together for what might be one of the last times in our family home. Not demanded, not insisted, suggested. My eldest, Michael, 34 and perpetually between business opportunities, immediately launched into a lecture about how I was being manipulative. "Mom, we're adults now," he said, pacing around my kitchen in the expensive Italian shoes I'd bought him for his last job interview. "We have our own lives, our own traditions. You can't expect us to drop everything just because you're feeling sentimental." Sarah, 31 and working as a marketing consultant in the city, was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "Maybe we could do New Year's instead," she offered, not looking up from her phone. "Christmas is just so hectic, and David and I were planning to go to his parents' cabin in Vermont." David, her boyfriend of 2 years, was a nice enough man, but I'd noticed he'd grown considerably more attentive to Sarah after learning about my substantial retirement portfolio. My youngest, Emma, 28 and supposedly pursuing her master's degree in art therapy, just shrugged. "I already told my friends I'd spend Christmas with them. We're doing this whole Friendsgiving thing, but for Christmas, it's going to be so much more authentic than family drama." Authentic. That word stung more than I let on, because what wasn't authentic about the woman who'd worked 60-hour weeks as a financial advisor to put all 3 of them through private school? What wasn't authentic about the mother who'd delayed her own retirement by 5 years to help Michael start his first business, the one that failed spectacularly when he decided he was too good for his customer? What wasn't authentic about supporting Sarah through law school before she decided corporate law was soul-crushing and pivoted to marketing? What wasn't authentic about paying for Emma's undergraduate degree, her therapy certification, and now her graduate program, all while she lived rent-free in my guest house? But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I swallowed my disappointment and said I understood. I suggested maybe we could do a small celebration before they all scattered to their respective plans. Even that was met with sighs and reluctant agreement. Like I was asking them to donate organs rather than spend an evening with the woman who'd given them everything. The actual abandonment happened 2 weeks before Christmas. I'd been feeling unwell, nothing serious, just a persistent fatigue that my doctor wanted to monitor, and I'd mentioned to Michael that I might need some help getting to a few medical appointments. He immediately went into crisis mode, not about my health, but about the inconvenience to his schedule. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said during an emergency family conference call that I wasn't invited to but overheard through Emma's phone when she forgot to hang up properly. "She's becoming dependent. First it's Christmas guilt, now it's medical appointments. Next she'll want to move in with one of us." Sarah's voice was crisp and businesslike. "We need to set boundaries. I've been reading about this. It's called emotional manipulation through manufactured crisis." She's probably not even that sick. Emma, my baby, the one I'd rocked through countless nightmares and supported through her quarter-life crisis and her art phase and her vegan phase and her spiritual awakening phase, delivered the final blow. Maybe it's time we had a conversation about her living situation. That house is way too big for one person, and honestly, the upkeep costs are probably stressing her out. There are some really nice senior communities in the area. Senior communities, at 62, because I'd asked for help getting to a doctor's appointment. That's when they presented me with their solution. They'd found me a lovely assisted living facility in Florida, assisted living, not a senior community anymore, and they'd already put down a deposit. It was near a beach, they said. I'd love the weather. I'd make new friends. It would be a fresh start. We've been talking, Michael said, sitting in my living room like he was conducting a board meeting, and we think this is what's best for everyone. You'll have professional care. We won't have to worry about you being alone in this big house, and honestly, Mom, you'll be happier. I asked what would happen to my house, the home I'd bought and decorated and maintained for 3 decades. Sarah had clearly prepared for this question. We'll handle the sale. Don't worry about any of the logistics. We know a great realtor. I asked when this transition was supposed to happen. Emma, avoiding my eyes, mumbled something about as soon as possible, and the sooner the better for your adjustment period. I asked if they'd considered that I might want some input in this decision about my own life. The silence that followed was more telling than any argument could have been. That's when I realized my children weren't trying to help me. They were trying to eliminate me as a responsibility while gaining access to my most valuable asset. The house in Westchester was worth just over $2 million. My retirement accounts were worth considerably more, and they'd grown tired of pretending they loved me enough to earn their inheritance through basic human decency. But I didn't explode. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue. I just said I needed time to think about it, and they exchanged those little glances that parents know. The ones that say she's being difficult again. Michael stood up and straightened his tie. Take all the time you need, Mom, but the deposit is non-refundable, and they're holding the spot until January 15th. January 15th. 6 weeks to dismantle my entire life and disappear to Florida so they could get on with theirs. That night I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and my financial planning software, and started making calculations. Not about assisted living costs or house sales, but about something much more interesting. I calculated exactly how much money I'd given my children over the past decade. Not loans, not investments, not money I expected back. Gifts. Michael's failed restaurant venture, $85,000. Sarah's law school and subsequent career changes, $112,000. Emma's education and living expenses, $97,000. The cars, the trips, the emergency funds, the temporary help with rent and mortgages and credit card debt. It all added up to just over $430,000. $430,000 in gifts to children who thought I was becoming a burden that needed to be managed. I leaned back in my chair and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity, not anger, not hurt, but a cold, sharp understanding of exactly who my children had become, and exactly what they thought I was worth to them. The next morning I called my attorney, Patricia Hendricks, a woman I'd known for 15 years and trusted completely. I told her I needed to make some changes to my estate planning, and I needed them done quickly and quietly. What kind of changes? She asked. The kind that my children won't see coming until it's too late. Patricia had handled my finances long enough to know that when I spoke in that tone, I wasn't being dramatic. I was being strategic. She scheduled me for that afternoon. The changes I made weren't vindictive, they were educational. I restructured my will so that my children's inheritances were tied to specific conditions. Conditions they'd need to meet over a period of years, not just show up and claim after my death. I established a trust that would require them to demonstrate financial responsibility, family commitment, and basic human decency if they wanted access to my estate. Most importantly, I transferred the deed of my house into the trust with very specific terms about when and how it could be sold. But those were long-term consequences. For the immediate lesson, I needed something more direct. I started by researching exactly how much my children owed, not to creditors, but to their current lifestyle expectation. Michael's rent in Manhattan was $4,000 a month, and I'd been supplementing it for 2 years. Sarah's car payments, insurance, and the expensive gym membership she considered essential were all coming out of an account I funded. Emma's graduate school tuition, her art supplies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Her therapy sessions, even her organic grocery bills, all me. Then I did something I'd never done before. I added up every recurring payment I made on their behalf and calculated what would happen if those payments simply stopped. Michael would have 3 months before he'd need to find a cheaper apartment or get a roommate. Sarah would have to choose between her car and her lifestyle. Emma would have to make some very grown-up decisions about whether her master's degree was worth working a real job. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to do anything dramatic. I just had to stop doing the things I'd been doing so automatically that they'd forgotten they weren't entitled to them, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. My children had grown skilled at crisis management. When it came to extracting money from me, they'd call with emergencies, with opportunities, with guilt trips about how they just needed one more month, or one more payment, or one more loan to get back on their feet. They'd learn to navigate my emotions, like professional manipulators, and they'd do it again, so I needed them to understand that their financial security wasn't just connected to my generosity, it was completely dependent on it. And the best way to teach that lesson was to let them feel what complete financial insecurity looked like, just for a little while. The plan I developed was simple in concept but devastating in execution. I would systematically withdraw my financial support from all 3 of my children simultaneously, but I wouldn't tell them why. I'd let them think it was related to my health issues and my transition to assisted living. I'd let them believe that my money was tied up in medical expenses and moving costs, and I'd watch them scramble to maintain the lifestyles they'd built on my foundation without ever acknowledging that the foundation existed. Phase 1 was the easy. I simply stopped making the payments I'd been making automatically. No fanfare, no announcements, just a quiet cessation of the financial support they'd taken for granted. Michael's rent supplement, Sarah's car payment, Emma's tuition money, all of it just stopped flowing. Phase 2 required more creativity. I started having conversations with each of them about my financial concerns related to my health and the move to Florida. I mentioned that I was having to reorganize my assets, and that there might be some temporary disruptions in my ability to help with their expenses. I said it with the kind of worried, apologetic tone that suggested I was as upset about it as they were, which made it harder for them to argue. Phase 3 was the most psychologically complex. I began documenting every interaction I had with my children, not for legal purposes, but for my own clarity. I wanted to see exactly how they responded when they thought my money might not be available. I wanted to see if they'd show concern for my well-being, or just concern for their access to my bank account. The results were both predictable and heartbreaking. Michael was the first to crack. He called on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into my experiment, with panic in his voice. "Mom, there's been some kind of mistake with my rent account. The payment didn't go through, and my landlord is saying I'm behind. Can you call the bank?" I told him I'd been having some issues with my accounts due to the medical expenses and the arrangements for Florida, and that he might need to cover his rent himself for a month or 2 while I sorted things out. The silence on the other end of the call was profound. Not concern for my health, not questions about what kind of medical expenses, just silence, while he processed that his financial safety net had a hole in it. "How am I supposed to come up with $4,000? He finally asked. "The same way most adults do," I said gently. "You budget for it, but I don't have $4,000 lying around, Mom. My expenses are calculated based on—" I thought you were handling that part." "I was," I said, "but things changed." He hung up without asking how I was feeling or if there was anything he could do to help with my medical situation. He called back an hour later with a different strategy. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe this Florida thing is a mistake. Maybe you should stay here where we can keep an eye on you. I could move back into the house temporarily, help with the upkeep, make sure you're not being taken advantage of by medical people, move back into the house, where he could keep an eye on me." It was almost funny how transparent he was. "That's sweet," I said, "but I think the change will be good for me. Besides, if you moved back in, how would you afford your apartment?" "Well," I figured, I mean, if I'm helping you, maybe the rent thing could work itself out. Helping me by living in my house rent-free while I paid for his Manhattan apartment. I told him I'd think about it. Sarah's response was more sophisticated, but equally revealing. She didn't call about a specific payment. She scheduled a lunch meeting like she was handling a business negotiation. I'm concerned about these financial disruptions you mentioned, she said over her organic salad, pulling out a legal pad like she was conducting a consultation. I think we need to get a clearer picture of your assets and liabilities, so we can plan appropriately. She'd made a list of questions about my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, my insurance policies, even my monthly expenses. She wanted to help me optimize my financial situation during this transition. It's really just a matter of making sure you're not being taken advantage of, she said. There are a lot of predatory practices in the senior care industry. I asked if she'd researched the assisted living facility they'd chosen for me with the same attention to detail. She looked momentarily uncomfortable and said that was different because they'd already vetted that. But maybe we should put a hold on that plan, she continued, until we can do a full financial analysis. I could take over managing your accounts temporarily, just to make sure everything's organized. Take over managing my account. My daughter, who'd changed careers 3 times in 5 years, and still occasionally asked me to help with her credit card payments, wanted to take over managing the retirement portfolio I'd built through 30 years of financial planning expertise. I told her I appreciated her concern, but that I was working with my existing financial advisor and attorney to handle the transition. She pressed for details about which advisor, which attorney, what specific steps I was taking. When I remained vague, she grew frustrated. Mom, we're trying to help you, but you're being secretive about everything. It's like you don't trust us. Trust? That was an interesting word choice from someone who was cataloging my assets while expressing concern for my welfare. Emma's reaction was the most emotionally manipulative, which surprised me because she'd always been the most genuinely affectionate of my children. She didn't call about money directly. She called crying about how stressed she was about school, and how she was worried about me, and how everything was falling apart at once. I just feel so helpless, she sobbed into the phone. You're dealing with all this medical stuff, and the move, and I can't even focus on my thesis, because I'm worried about you, and now there are all these issues with my school payments, and I don't know what to do. She'd positioned it perfectly. Her financial crisis and my health issues were all part of the same overwhelming situation that required my immediate attention and assistance. What kind of issues with school payments? Well, the tuition payment didn't process, and they're saying I might not be able to register for next semester if it's not resolved soon. And I know you said you were having banking problems, but I thought maybe there was some way to fix it, because this is my education. We're talking about my education, like it was a shared investment rather than a gift I'd been giving her. How much do you have in your own accounts? I asked. Mom, you know I don't have that kind of money. I'm a student. You're 28 years old, I said gently. Most students your age have jobs, but you always said my job was to focus on school. I did say that, I agreed, but maybe it's time to consider whether you can do both. The crying intensified. Are you saying you won't help me anymore? I'm saying that things are changing, and we all need to adapt. But I can't just get a regular job. I'm not qualified for anything that would pay enough to cover tuition and living expenses. I'd have to drop out. Or you could take out student loans like most graduate students do. Student loans? She said it like I'd suggested she sell a kidney. But I thought, I mean, that's what parents are for, right? To help their kids avoid debt. That's what parents are for, to help their kids avoid the consequences that most adults face when making choices about education and career. By the end of that conversation, I understood that my children didn't see me as a person who was aging and might need support. They saw me as a financial resource that was malfunctioning and needed to be repaired or replaced. The Christmas Eve abandonment was the culmination of 6 weeks of watching my children reveal exactly who they'd become. They'd grown increasingly frustrated with my financial disorganization and my resistance to help. They'd staged 2 more interventions about the Florida plan, both of which felt more like hostile takeovers than family meetings. The final straw came when I suggested that maybe we should postpone any major decisions until after the holiday. I said I was feeling overwhelmed, and needed some time to process everything without pressure. Michael exploded. This is exactly the problem, Mom. You're not thinking clearly. You're making decisions based on emotions instead of logic, and it's affecting all of us. Sarah was more controlled, but equally cold. We can't put our lives on hold indefinitely while you figure out what you want. We've already made commitments based on the assumption that you'd be moving to Florida. What kind of commitments? I asked. The look they exchanged told me everything I needed to know before Sarah answered. Financial commitments. They'd already spent money they expected to get from selling my house. They'd made plans based on their inheritance being accelerated by my move to assisted living. They weren't concerned about my well-being. They were concerned about their cash flow. That's when they delivered their ultimatum. They'd arranged for a car service to take me to the train station on Christmas Eve. They'd bought me a ticket to Philadelphia, where I could catch a connecting train to the Florida facility. They'd already shipped some of my belongings ahead. They'd taken care of everything. We thought it would be easier if we handled all the logistics, Emma said, not meeting my eyes. The holidays are so emotional already. You're sending me away on Christmas Eve? I asked. We're helping you start your new life, Michael corrected. The timing is actually perfect because you'll be settled in by New Year's. I looked at my 3 children, these adults I'd raised and supported and loved unconditionally, and saw strangers who'd calculated that I was worth more to them as an asset to be liquidated than as a person to be cherished. And if I refused to go, why would you refuse? Sarah asked. This is what's best for everyone. I didn't argue anymore. I didn't cry or plead or try to change their mind. I just nodded and said I'd be ready. But I wasn't ready to disappear quietly into their convenient narrative. I was ready to teach them what it felt like to have the people you counted on decide you were no longer worth their consideration. Standing on that platform at Penn Station, watching the taillights of the Mercedes disappear into the Christmas Eve traffic, I felt something inside me crystallize into pure determination. My children had just made the biggest miscalculation of their lives. They thought they were getting rid of a problem, but what they'd actually done was liberate the one person who knew exactly how to dismantle their comfortable existence, piece by piece. The train to Philadelphia wasn't leaving for another 2 hours, which gave me plenty of time to make some calls. I found a quiet corner near the information booth, pulled out my phone and started with Patricia Hendricks. Even though it was Christmas Eve, I knew she'd answer. That's the kind of relationship you build when someone has been managing your legal affairs for 15 years. Lisa, I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. How did the conversation with your children go? Better than expected, I said, watching the holiday crowds rush past me. They've just shown me exactly who they are, and now I know exactly what needs to be done. I told her about the forced departure, the ultimatum, the way they'd treated my life like a business transaction they were eager to close. Patricia listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Those changes we made to your estate plan, and she finally said, I think we need to accelerate the timeline. My thoughts exactly, but first, I need you to do something that might seem unusual. I explained what I wanted her to do first thing after Christmas. Patricia was going to contact each of my children individually and inform them that there had been complications with my estate planning related to my medical situation. She would tell them that some of my accounts had been frozen pending a review of my mental competency, and that all financial support would be suspended indefinitely while the matter was being resolved. You want me to tell them you might be declared mentally incompetent? I want you to tell them that the state has questions about recent large financial transfers, and that until those questions are resolved, all of my assets are being held in trust pending investigation. It was brilliant in its simplicity. My children had spent weeks questioning my mental state and my ability to make decisions about my own life. Now they'd discover what happened when those concerns were taken seriously by people with actual legal authority. How long do you want this to last? Patricia asked. Long enough for them to understand what their lives look like without my money. I'm thinking 90 days should do it. And what if they try to contest it or demand then they'll discover that questioning my mental competency opens up a very thorough investigation into my financial affairs, including a detailed accounting of where my money has gone over the past decade. Somehow I don't think they'll want that level of scrutiny. Patricia agreed to handle the legal aspects, but I had my own calls to make. The first was to Dr. Rodriguez, my physician. I needed to clarify some things about my recent medical appointments that my children had apparently misunderstood. Dr. Rodriguez, this is Lisa Brown. I know it's Christmas Eve, but I need to ask you about something. My children seem to be under the impression that I'm having serious health issues that affect my mental capacity. I wanted to confirm with you that my recent fatigue was related to stress, not dementia. Rodriguez sounded confused. Lisa, you know you're in excellent health for someone your age. The blood work was normal. Your cognitive function is sharp as ever. Where did they get the idea that you were having mental capacity issues? From their own wishful thinking, apparently. Would you be willing to put that assessment in writing? I may need it for legal purposes. My next call was to my financial advisor, Robert. Robert had been managing my retirement portfolio for 8 years, and he'd watched it grow from substantial to impressive through careful planning and conservative investments. He also happened to know exactly how much money I'd been giving my children because he'd been the one advising me to stop. Robert, I need you to implement that discussion we had about restructuring my liquid assets, the one where we talked about moving everything into long-term investments that would be harder for family members to access. That's the one. How quickly can we make that happen? If you're sure about this, I can have the paperwork ready by December 27th. But Lisa, once we lock these funds into the structured accounts we discussed, it'll take significant time and legal proceedings to reverse it. Perfect. That's exactly what I want. Robert had been suggesting this restructuring for 2 years, ever since he'd noticed the pattern of large withdrawals that coincided with my children's various financial crises. He'd warned me that I was depleting my retirement security to fund their lifestyle choices, and I'd resisted because I thought supporting my children was more important than protecting myself. Now I understood that supporting them had actually been enabling them, and protecting myself was the only way to teach them the difference between family obligation and financial manipulation. But the immediate lesson required more than just cutting off their money supply. My children needed to experience the full consequences of treating someone's love like a renewable resource they could exploit indefinitely. My third call was to Marcus Thompson, a private investigator who'd helped me with some client issues when I was still working as a financial advisor. Marcus specialized in background checks and asset verification, and I had a feeling he was going to find some very interesting information about my children's financial situations. Marcus, I need you to run comprehensive financial background checks on 3 people. I want to know every account, every debt, every asset, and every liability they have. These wouldn't happen to be family members, would they? They would. And Marcus, I want to know exactly how much trouble they're going to be in when certain sources of income suddenly disappear. Marcus agreed to start immediately and have preliminary reports ready within a week. He also mentioned something that hadn't occurred to me. Lisa, if you're planning what I think you're planning, you might want to consider having me document their recent behavior toward you. If this turns into a legal battle over financial abuse of an elderly person, you'll want evidence that you were competent and that they were acting against your interest. Financial abuse of an elderly person. I was 62, sharp as a tack, and financially savvy enough to have built a multi-million-dollar retirement portfolio, but my children had been treating me like I was an incompetent old woman whose money was theirs to manage. Maybe it was time they learned what actual legal scrutiny of that behavior looked like. By the time I boarded the train to Philadelphia, I'd set in motion a series of events that would systematically dismantle every assumption my children had made about their financial security. But I wasn't done. The train ride gave me 2 hours to plan the next phase of their education. I pulled out my laptop and started documenting everything I could remember about their attitudes toward money, their spending habits, and their complete lack of awareness about where their comfortable lifestyles actually came from. Michael's restaurant had failed because he'd never learned to manage cash flow or treat customers with respect. He'd blamed the failure on market conditions and unrealistic expectations, never acknowledging that I'd warned him from the beginning about his business plan. Sarah had dropped out of law school after 2 years because she'd decided the work was morally compromising, but she'd never returned the money I'd spent on her education. Instead, she'd seamlessly transitioned to asking for marketing career support, as if career changes were something other people funded for you. Emma was the most troubling case because she'd never worked a real job in her life. She'd gone from high school to college to graduate school with every expense covered, and she'd developed this artistic temperament that treated financial responsibility like it was beneath her intellectual pursuit. All three of them had grown up believing that money appeared when you needed it, that financial security was something you inherited rather than earned, and that their mother's role was to serve as a bottomless ATM that dispensed cash without expecting accountability. But here's what they'd forgotten in their rush to warehouse me in Florida. I wasn't just their mother, I was a woman who'd built a financial planning business from nothing. I understood money not just as a resource, but as a tool of power and leverage, and they'd just given me every motivation I needed to use that tool against them. The assisted living facility in Boca Raton was exactly what you'd expect from a place chosen by people who wanted to park an inconvenient relative somewhere clean and expensive. It was pristine, efficiently managed, and completely soulless. The staff was professionally cheerful, the activities were infantilizing, and the other residents seemed to fall into two categories: wealthy people whose families had made the same calculation mine had, and wealthy people who'd given up on having any agency in their own life. I checked in, smiled at the orientation presentation, and immediately started planning my exit strategy, but not before I'd established exactly what my children thought they'd accomplished by sending me there. The facility director, a polished woman named Catherine Walsh, explained that my children had prepaid for 6 months, and had indicated this would likely be a permanent arrangement. They'd also signed forms indicating that they would be my primary contacts and decision-makers if any health issues arose. "Your son Michael mentioned that you'd been having some cognitive difficulties," she said, reviewing my file. "We have excellent memory care programs if those issues progress." Cognitive difficulties. Michael had told them I was developing dementia to justify warehousing me. I asked to see exactly what he'd written on my intake form. According to the paperwork, I was suffering from increasing confusion about financial matters, difficulty making decisions, and tendency toward paranoid thinking about family members. Sarah had signed as a witness to these observations, confirming that the family was concerned about mother's declining judgment and increasing dependence. They'd created a paper trail that painted me as an incompetent old woman who needed to be managed for her own protection. It was a masterpiece of manipulation that would have been brilliant if I'd actually been the helpless victim they'd described. Instead, I was a competent adult who now had documented evidence that my children had lied to medical professionals in order to gain control over my living situation, and presumably my finances. I spent my first night in Florida making a list of everyone I needed to contact, and everything I needed to document. The beautiful thing about being in an assisted living facility was that it gave me unlimited time to plan and no family interruptions to derail my focus. The next morning, Christmas Day, I called my children to let them know I'd arrived safely. Each conversation was a masterclass in fake concern and badly disguised relief. Michael answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting for confirmation that I was out of his hair. "Mom, how was the trip? Are you settling in okay?" "It's very nice," I said. "The staff has been explaining all the services and programs. Did you know that they have excellent legal advocacy services for residents who are concerned about financial abuse?" "Financial abuse? Mom, what are you talking about?" "Oh, just some of the educational materials they gave me. Apparently, it's very common for elderly people to be taken advantage of by family members who gain control of their assets. The staff here is trained to recognize the signs." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I continued cheerfully. "They're particularly concerned about cases where family members make false claims about mental competency in order to justify taking control of someone's living situation. Apparently, that's a red flag for financial exploitation." "Mom, Nobody's trying to exploit you, we're trying to help you. Of course you are, sweetheart. I'm sure when the attorneys review the intake forms you filled out, they'll understand that you had my best interests at heart when you described my cognitive difficulties. Another long pause. What attorneys? The ones who handle advocacy for residents. They review all the intake documentation to make sure families aren't misrepresenting their relatives' conditions. It's just standard procedure, nothing to worry about. I wasn't lying exactly. The facility did have legal advocacy services and they did review intake forms. I just wasn't mentioning that I hadn't actually requested a review yet. My conversation with Sarah was even more revealing. She immediately went into damage control mode, asking detailed questions about what I'd told the staff, what kind of documentation they'd requested, and whether I'd signed anything that might complicate my situation. I'm just concerned that you might misunderstand the legal implications of some of these advocacy services, she said. Sometimes they create problems where none existed before. What kind of problem? Well, if there are questions about your competency or your family's motivations, it could trigger investigations that would be stressful for everyone involved. Investigations into what? Into financial transfers, decision-making capacity, whether your living situation was arranged appropriately. It's just bureaucracy, but it can be very disruptive. Sarah was worried that someone might actually examine what they'd done and how they'd done it. She was worried that their carefully constructed narrative about my declining mental state might not hold up under professional scrutiny. Emma's response was the most emotionally manipulative but also the most revealing about her complete disconnection from financial reality. She cried about how much she missed me already and how guilty she felt about the timing of everything, but then she seamlessly transitioned into asking about my transition budget. I know you said you were having some banking issues before you left, she said, but I'm hoping those are resolved now because I'm really struggling with the tuition situation. What kind of struggling? Well, the payment still hasn't gone through, and the school is saying I might lose my spot if it's not resolved by January 3rd. I was hoping that maybe now that you're settled you could handle it from there. Now that I was settled, like being shipped off to assisted living had somehow improved my ability to pay her tuition. Emma, sweetheart, I'm going to be honest with you, my financial situation is more complicated than I initially realized. The move, the medical expenses, the legal arrangements, it's all much more expensive than I anticipated. But what about the house sale? I thought that was going to cover everything. The house sale is on hold pending some legal review. Apparently, when you move into a care facility, there are waiting periods and asset evaluations that have to be completed before any major financial transactions can proceed. This was also not entirely untrue. There were regulations about asset transfers for people in care facilities, particularly when those transfers might affect their eligibility for various benefits. I just wasn't mentioning that those regulations didn't apply to my situation, since I was paying privately and hadn't claimed any need for financial assistance. How long do these reviews take? It varies, could be months, could be longer if there are complications. What kind of complication? Oh, questions about whether the move was voluntary, whether my mental state was accurately represented, whether family members were acting in my best interests or their own financial interests. Standard stuff. But it can drag on if there are inconsistencies in the documentation. Emma started crying again, but this time it wasn't manipulation. It was genuine panic. She was starting to understand that her financial support wasn't just temporarily disrupted, it was potentially gone indefinitely. After I hung up from that conversation, I sat in my sterile little apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete control over my own life. For the first time since my children had become adults, I wasn't reactive to their crises, their demands, or their emotional manipulation. I was proactive, strategic, and completely focused on teaching them the most important lesson of their lives. But the lesson wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about recognizing that the people who love you are not resources to be exploited. It was about understanding that support is earned through behavior, not demanded through entitlement. Over the next week I received daily calls from all three children, and the progression was fascinating to observe. At first they were concerned about logistics. When would my banking issues be resolved? When would the house sale proceed?
when would their financial support resume. Then they moved into problem-solving mode, offering to help me navigate the bureaucracy, suggesting we hire lawyers to expedite the process, even proposing that they come to Florida to assist me directly. When I politely declined all their offers of help, they shifted into bargaining. Maybe I could access some emergency funds just to cover the most pressing expenses. Maybe there were some accounts that weren't frozen. Maybe I could ask the facility administrators to help resolve the banking issue. But as the days passed and their own financial situations grew more precarious, the conversations became increasingly desperate. Michael had to ask his landlord for an extension on his rent payment. Sarah discovered that her car was about to be repossessed. Emma learned that graduate students who don't pay tuition get academically dismissed regardless of their artistic temperament. The beautiful irony was that they'd created their own trap. They couldn't demand that I fix their financial problems because they'd spent weeks telling everyone I was mentally incompetent.
They couldn't accuse me of manipulating them because they'd established a narrative that I was confused and dependent. They couldn't even get angry at me because that would contradict their own story about being loving children who'd made difficult decisions for my own protection. By New Year's Day, exactly 1 week after they'd abandoned me at Penn Station, all 3 of my children were experiencing genuine financial stress for the first time in their adult lives. And I was just getting started. The next phase of their education was going to be much more comprehensive, because I'd spent the week doing research that would have impressed Marcus Thompson. The assisted living facility had excellent internet access and unlimited time for residents to pursue their interests. My interest happened to be conducting a forensic analysis of my children's financial vulnerabilities. Michael's restaurant failure hadn't just cost me $85,000. It had also left him with significant personal debt that he'd been managing through a combination of credit cards and family support. Without my rent supplement, he was looking at a monthly shortfall of $3,500 with no obvious way to make up the difference. Sarah's marketing career was actually a series of contract positions that paid well but irregular. She'd been using my financial support to maintain cash flow between projects, but without that buffer, she was facing the reality that her lifestyle costs significantly exceeded her actual earning capacity. Emma's graduate program was the most expensive form of extended adolescence imaginable. Her tuition was $47,000 a year, but her living expenses, art supplies, therapy costs, and general lifestyle expenses brought her annual dependency on me to nearly $70,000. She'd never held a job that paid more than $15 an hour. But the most interesting discovery was what they'd planned to do with my house. I'd given Marcus Thompson permission to run background checks on all 3 children, and he'd found some fascinating information about their recent financial activities. 2 weeks before Christmas, Michael had applied for a business loan using my house as collateral. The loan application listed him as my financial power of attorney, and indicated that the property would be available as security once I was permanently relocated to supervised care. Sarah had been more sophisticated. She'd opened a business account for something called Brown Family Asset Management, and had been researching property management companies that specialized in estate liquidation for elderly transition clients. Emma had been the most direct. She'd contacted 3 different real estate agents about selling my house, telling them that I was moving to Florida for health reasons, and that the family wanted to move quickly to avoid emotional complication. They hadn't just planned to warehouse me in Florida. They'd already started liquidating my assets. They'd been so confident that I was too weak or too confused to resist their plans, that they'd begun spending money they didn't have yet, and making commitments based on inheriting my estate years ahead of schedule. Now, instead of gaining access to my assets, they were discovering what life looked like when all their assumptions about financial security turned out to be illusions. And this was still just the beginning of their education. The real lesson was going to start when they realized that my banking problems weren't temporary complications that would resolve themselves in a few weeks. They were permanent changes that reflected their new status in my life, not as beloved children whose needs would always be my priority, but as adults who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with access to my resources. I spent New Year's Eve in my temporary Florida apartment, watching the fireworks over the ocean and planning exactly how I was going to restructure my entire financial life to ensure my children never again had the opportunity to treat me like a commodity they could cash in when convenient. The next morning, I called Patricia Hendricks to begin implementing the most comprehensive financial restructuring of my life. It wasn't revenge. It was education, and my children were about to discover that when you mistake someone's generosity for weakness, you might find out how strong they actually are. The first week of January brought me Marcus Thompson's preliminary investigation reports, and what I read made my blood run cold. My children hadn't just been careless with my money or thoughtlessly dependent on my support. They'd been systematically planning to gain control of my assets for months, and their scheme was far more sophisticated than I'd imagined. Marcus had uncovered a paper trail that told a story of calculated manipulation. In September, 3 months before my forced departure, Sarah had consulted with an elder law attorney about protective asset management for aging parents. She'd asked specific questions about when families could legally intervene in financial decisions and what documentation would be required to establish mental incompetence. In October, Michael had met with a financial planner about inheritance acceleration strategies and had inquired about borrowing against future estate distributions. He'd provided detailed estimates of my net worth and had discussed timeline expectations for accessing those funds. In November, Emma had researched compassionate care placement services and had saved information about facilities that specialized in memory care transition. She'd even contacted my insurance company to ask about coverage for long-term care, despite my never having been diagnosed with any condition requiring such care. They'd been planning my removal for months while pretending to be concerned about my well-being. Every conversation about my health, every suggestion about downsizing, every expression of worry about me living alone, had been part of a coordinated campaign to justify what they'd already decided to do. But Marcus had found something even more disturbing. Michael's loan application hadn't just used my house as collateral. He'd forged my signature on a power of attorney document that would have given him legal control over my finances. The document was dated 3 weeks before Christmas, which meant he'd been preparing to steal my assets even before they'd told me about their Florida plan. I stared at the photocopy of my own signature, perfectly reproduced on a document I'd never seen, and felt something shift inside me from disappointment to fury. This wasn't just ingratitude or selfishness. This was fraud. This was elder abuse. This was a criminal conspiracy orchestrated by my own children. I called Patricia immediately. "Patricia, I need you to file criminal charges against Michael for forgery and attempted financial fraud. I also need you to investigate whether Sarah and Emma were accessories to this conspiracy." "Lisa, are you absolutely certain you want to pursue criminal charges against your own son?" "I'm certain. I want to pursue justice against someone who forged my signature to steal my house. The fact that he's my son makes it worse, not better." Patricia agreed to file the necessary paperwork, but she warned me that criminal charges would make everything public. There would be court proceedings, media attention if the case was significant enough, and permanent damage to my relationship with my children. "Patricia, they damaged the relationship when they decided I was worth more to them as an asset than as a person. I'm just making sure there are consequences for that choice." While Patricia handled the legal aspects, I turned my attention to the more immediate problem of my children's deteriorating financial situation. By the second week of January, their individual crises were becoming impossible to manage, and their attempts to contact me were growing increasingly desperate. Michael's landlord had started eviction proceedings. Without my monthly supplement, he couldn't cover his rent, and his credit cards were maxed out from trying to bridge the gap. He'd called me 6 times in 2 days, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails about needing emergency assistance to avoid homelessness. "Mom, I know you're dealing with your own issues, but I'm about to lose my apartment. I just need enough to get current on rent, and then I can figure out a longer-term solution. Please call me back." The longer-term solution, of course, was for me to resume paying his living expenses indefinitely. But Michael was about to learn that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with emergency phone calls. Sarah's situation was more complex but equally satisfying to observe. Her car had been repossessed, which meant she couldn't easily travel to client meetings, which meant she was losing contract opportunities, which meant her income was declining just as her need for transportation was increasing. She'd tried to lease a new car, but without my financial backing, her credit wasn't sufficient for the payments she could afford. She'd also discovered that her health insurance had been canceled. Apparently, I'd been covering her premium payments for so long that she'd forgotten they weren't automatic. Without insurance, her prescription costs and therapy sessions were suddenly unaffordable, which was creating additional stress that was affecting her work performance. Emma's crisis was the most dramatic because she'd never developed any coping skills for financial adversity. She'd been dropped from her graduate program for non-payment, which meant she also had to vacate the student housing I'd been funding. She had no job, no savings, no credit history, and no experience managing money because I'd managed everything for her entire adult life. She'd called me crying hysterically, begging me to contact the school and arrange a payment plan so she could resume her study. When I explained that my funds were still tied up in legal proceedings, she'd suggested I take out a loan against my house to cover her tuition. But Mom, this is my future we're talking about. I can't just stop my education because of some temporary banking problems. She still didn't understand that her financial support wasn't delayed, it was permanently discontinued. The most revealing aspect of all these conversations was how none of my children expressed any concern about my supposed health issues, or the supposed complications that were preventing me from accessing my money. They were entirely focused on solving their own financial problems, with no apparent awareness that I might be struggling too. It confirmed everything I'd suspected about their motivations. They didn't see me as a person who might need support during a difficult transition. They saw me as a malfunctioning ATM that needed to be repaired so it could resume dispensing cash. But their individual financial crises were just the beginning of their education. The real lesson started when they tried to coordinate their response to what they perceived as a temporary problem with a simple solution. On January 15th, exactly 1 month after they'd abandoned me at Penn Station, I received a conference call from all 3 children. They'd clearly planned this conversation in advance, and they'd assigned roles to each participant. Michael was the spokesperson. "Mom, we've been talking and we think there might be some miscommunication about your financial situation. We want to help you resolve whatever bureaucratic issues are preventing you from accessing your accounts." Sarah was the analyst. "I've been researching the regulations around asset management for care facility residents, and most of these holds can be resolved pretty quickly with the right legal assistance." Emma was the emotional appeal. "We're all really worried about you, and we want to make sure you have everything you need. But we're also concerned that you might not be getting good advice about your options." It was a coordinated intervention designed to pressure me into accepting their help, which would conveniently resolve their financial problems while re-establishing their access to my resources. "What kind of help are you offering?" I asked. "Well," Michael said, "we could come down to Florida and meet with your financial advisors directly. Sometimes these institutional bureaucracies respond better to family advocacy. We could also explore legal options," Sarah added. "If there are questions about your competency or your decision-making capacity, we could provide documentation of your mental acuity to expedite the review process. And if there are any emergency expenses you can't cover," Emma chimed in, "we could front the money temporarily and sort out the reimbursement later." It was almost beautiful in its transparency. They wanted to come to Florida, take control of my financial situation, resolve my banking problems, and re-establish the flow of money that funded their lifestyles. They were positioning themselves as my saviors while solving their own financial crisis. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I'm not comfortable with family members getting involved in my financial affairs. This situation is complicated enough without adding family dynamics to the mix." "But Mom," Michael pressed, "we're not just family members. We're the people who know you best and care about your well-being the most. We have a better understanding of your values and priorities than some bureaucrat who's never met you." "Actually," I said, "I'm not sure that's true anymore. The people who care about my well-being the most probably wouldn't have described me as mentally incompetent to justify moving me into assisted living against my wishes." The silence that followed was profound. They'd forgotten that their carefully constructed narrative about my declining mental state was documented in writing and could be used against them. Sarah recovered first, Those intake forms were just precautionary. We were trying to make sure you had access to all available services and support systems. By lying about my cognitive function, we weren't lying, Michael said defensively. We were being proactive about potential future needs that happened to justify gaining control over my living situation and my finances. Nobody's trying to control your finances, Mom. We're trying to help you access them. Help me access the money you've been spending for the past decade. That was the question they couldn't answer because it exposed the fundamental flaw in their logic. They couldn't claim to be concerned about my financial well-being while simultaneously depending on that financial well-being to fund their own lives. Emma tried a different approach. Mom, I think you're misunderstanding our motivations. We love you, and we want what's best for you. The money stuff is secondary. If the money is secondary, I said, then you shouldn't have any problem managing your own financial responsibilities while my assets are being reviewed. But that's not fair, she protested. We made decisions based on the assumption that you'd continue to help us the way you always have. You made decisions based on the assumption that I'd continue to pay for your lifestyle choices, regardless of how you treated me. That's not true. Emma, you researched memory care facilities for me while asking me to pay your tuition. Michael forged my signature on a power of attorney document while pretending to be concerned about my mental state. Sarah consulted elder law attorneys about controlling my assets while helping plan my removal from my own home. What part of that sounds like love rather than financial opportunism? The explosion that followed was everything I'd expected and more. Michael accused me of being paranoid and ungrateful. Sarah lectured me about family loyalty and mutual responsibility. Emma cried about how I was ruining her life and destroying her future. But buried in all their anger and accusations was the admission I'd been waiting for. In their fury at having their financial support cut off, they revealed exactly how they'd been thinking about our relationship. You can't just stop being our mother because you're having some kind of emotional breakdown, Michael shouted. You have responsibilities to them, not relationships with them, not love for them, but financial responsibilities that I was obligated to fulfill regardless of how they treated me. What responsibilities do I have to adults who lied about my mental health to justify stealing my house? I asked. We weren't stealing anything, we were trying to preserve your assets and make sure they were managed appropriately. Managed by whom? By people who understand your values and your intentions. People like Michael, who forged my signature. People like Sarah, who researched how to have me declared incompetent. People like Emma, who thinks tuition payments are more important than treating me with basic respect. We do respect you, Mom. That's why we made these difficult decisions. Someone had to be the adult in this situation. Someone had to be the adult. My 34-year-old son, who'd never held a job for more than 2 years, and whose business had failed because he couldn't manage basic customer relationships, was lecturing me about being an adult. Michael, I said quietly, you forged my signature on legal documents. That's not being an adult, that's being a criminal. What are you talking about? The power of attorney document you used to apply for a loan against my house, the one with my signature that I never signed. That's called forgery, and it's a felony. The silence was different this time, not shocked silence, but terrified silence. I don't know what you think you found, but I found photocopies of the documents you filed with the bank. I also found records of your conversations with the loan officer about your timeline for accessing my assets. It's all very well documented. You can't prove I forged anything. Actually, I can. I had my signature analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert. Would you like to guess what they found? I was bluffing about the handwriting analysis. But Michael didn't know that. What I did have was Marcus Thompson's investigation, Patricia Hendricks' legal expertise, and a growing file of evidence that painted a very clear picture of attempted financial fraud. You're trying to have me arrested? His voice had gone very small. I'm trying to have justice served. If that results in your arrest, that's a consequence of your choices, not mine. Sarah jumped in, trying to control the damage. Mom, I think we all need to step back
and approach this more rationally. There might be some misunderstandings that can be resolved without involving lawyers or law enforcement. What kind of misunderstandings? Maybe Michael made some mistakes in the paperwork. Maybe some documents were filed incorrectly. Maybe there were communication breakdowns that created confusion about your intentions. Sarah was trying to minimize felony fraud as paperwork mistakes and communication breakdowns. It was impressive in its audacity and pathetic in its desperation. Sarah, your brother forged my signature to try to steal my house. That's not a communication breakdown, that's a crime. But prosecuting him won't solve anything. It'll just create more problems for everyone. It'll solve the problem of him thinking he can commit fraud without consequence. What do you want from us, Mom? What would it take to resolve this without destroying our family? That was the question I'd been waiting for. What did I want from them? I wanted them to understand that treating someone's love like a renewable resource eventually depletes. I wanted them to experience the consequences of mistaking generosity for weakness. I wanted them to learn that financial security built on someone else's sacrifice isn't security at all. It's dependence disguised as entitlement. But most of all, I wanted them to understand that respect isn't something you can demand after you've proven you don't deserve it. What I want, I said, is for you to experience what it feels like to be treated the way you treated me. I want you to know what it's like to have the people you count on decide you're not worth their consideration. I want you to understand the difference between family support and financial exploitation. We never exploited you. You lied about my mental health to justify controlling my living situation. You forged my signature to steal my assets. You planned my removal from my own home while pretending to be concerned about my well-being. What would you call that? Emma was crying again, but this time it wasn't manipulation. It was genuine recognition of what they'd done. We didn't mean for it to be like that. We thought we were helping. You thought you were helping yourselves to my money while getting rid of me as an inconvenience. That's not fair. Fair would have been asking me what I wanted instead of deciding what was convenient for you. Fair would have been treating me like a person whose opinions mattered instead of a problem that needed to be solved. Fair would have been acknowledging that supporting you financially for the past decade was a gift, not an obligation. So what happens now? Michael asked. You're just going to cut us off forever. You're going to have me arrested. You're going to destroy our family over money. I'm not destroying our family over money. You destroyed our family when you decided money was more important than treating me with basic human dignity. I'm just making sure there are consequences for that choice. But what about Emma's education? What about Sarah's career? What about my housing situation? We can't just start over from nothing. Why not? Most adults manage to support themselves without their parents funding their lifestyles indefinitely. But we're not most adults. We're your children. You're adults who happen to be my children, and adults are responsible for the consequences of their choices. The conversation ended with threats, tears, and accusations, but it also ended with a clear understanding of our new reality. My children were no longer my financial dependents, and I was no longer their emergency fund. They were going to learn to support themselves, or they were going to fail trying, but they were going to do it without my money. What they didn't know yet was that their financial education was just beginning. The criminal charges against Michael were only the first phase of consequences they'd face for their betrayal. The real reckoning was still coming, and it was going to teach them lessons about respect, responsibility, and the real cost of treating family like a business transaction. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched from my temporary Florida residence as their carefully constructed lives began to collapse in ways that were both predictable and profoundly satisfying. Michael's eviction proceeded on schedule, and he ended up moving in with a friend who charged him more rent than he could afford for a couch in a studio apartment. Sarah's business collapsed as her transportation and communication infrastructure fell apart, and she was forced to take a retail job that paid less than half her previous income. Emma moved back in with friends from college, sleeping on floors and borrowing money for basic necessities, while trying to figure out how to restart her education with student loans and part-time work. But the most interesting development was how they started turning on each other as their individual situations became more desperate.
Michael blamed Sarah for encouraging the Florida plan that had triggered my financial retaliation. Sarah blamed Emma for being too demanding and creating the impression that they were financially exploiting me. Emma blamed both of them for being too aggressive and not considering the emotional impact of their decisions on my mental state. They'd been so united in their plan to manage my assets that they'd never considered what would happen if that plan failed. Now they were discovering that their alliance had been based on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection, and without the benefit, the alliance was dissolving into mutual recrimination. I found their dysfunction oddly comforting. It confirmed that my assessment of their character had been accurate, and it validated my decision to protect myself from people who would exploit family relationships for financial gain. But I also knew that their current suffering, while satisfying, wasn't sufficient to teach them the deeper lessons they needed to learn. They still saw me as the problem rather than recognizing their own behavior as the cause of their difficulty. They still thought this was a temporary crisis that could be resolved through negotiation rather than a permanent consequence of choices they'd made about who they wanted to be. The next phase of their education was going to require showing them exactly how much control they'd actually given me when they'd tried to control me. And that lesson was going to change everything they thought they knew about power, family, and the price of betrayal. February brought the moment I'd been waiting for since Christmas Eve. Patricia called with news that would change everything my children thought they knew about their futures. The criminal charges against Michael had been filed, but that was just the opening move in a much larger game. Lisa, the district attorney's office is very interested in this case. Apparently, elder financial abuse cases involving forged documents are a priority, especially when there's evidence of conspiracy among multiple family members. Conspiracy. They think Sarah and Emma were involved in the forgery. They think Sarah and Emma were involved in a broader pattern of financial manipulation designed to gain access to your assets. The consultation with the elder law attorney, the research into competency proceedings, the coordination of your removal to assisted living. It all points to a coordinated effort. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Florida air condition. I'd wanted consequences for my children's behavior, but hearing it described as a criminal conspiracy made the reality of what they'd done somehow more stark. What does this mean for them? It means they're all potentially facing serious charges. Michael is looking at forgery, attempted fraud, and elder abuse. Sarah could be charged as an accessory and for conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Emma might face charges related to conspiracy and participating in the development of false documentation about your mental state. Patricia explained that the prosecutor's office had been building a case against families who targeted elderly relatives for financial exploitation, and my situation fit their profile perfectly. They had documented evidence of planning, coordination, false statements about my competency, and attempted theft of assets. They want to make an example of this case because it demonstrates how sophisticated these family-based financial abuse schemes can be. An example: my children were going to become cautionary tales about what happened when families decided their elderly relatives were worth more as sources of money than as people deserving respect. But before the criminal case could proceed, something unexpected happened that would complicate everything I thought I knew about my children's motivations. Marcus Thompson called with information that made me reconsider whether I fully understood the scope of what they'd been planning. His deeper investigation had uncovered financial records that painted a much more disturbing picture than simple greed or entitlement. Lisa, I found something that changes everything. Your children weren't just planning to control your assets. They were planning to liquidate them completely. Marcus had discovered that Sarah's Brown Family Asset Management Company wasn't just a vehicle for managing my estate. It was connected to a broader network of companies that specialized in what could only be described as estate liquidation fraud. They were working with a firm called Heritage Wealth Transitions that has a very specific business model. They identify elderly individuals with substantial assets and adult children who are financially dependent. Then they provide consultation services to help the children gain control of the parents' assets as quickly as possible. You're saying this was bigger than just my family. I'm saying your children were getting professional advice on how to systematically strip your wealth and hide their involvement. This wasn't amateur hour. This was a coordinated operation designed to make your assets disappear while providing legal cover for the people taking them. Marcus had found email communications between Sarah and Heritage Wealth Transitions, dating back 6 months. The consultations had covered everything from competency evaluations to asset protection strategies, to end-of-life care planning that minimizes family exposure to estate tax. They'd been planning not just to control my money, but to ensure that by the time I died, there would be very little estate left to distribute. They wanted to spend my wealth while I was alive and unable to stop them, leaving just enough to avoid suspicion but not enough to matter. How much are we talking about? Based on their projections, they estimated they could access roughly 80% of your total net worth within 2 years of gaining guardianship. The assisted living placement was just the first step in a much longer process. I had to sit down. My children hadn't just been planning to warehouse me in Florida. They'd been planning to systematically loot my life savings while I was still alive to watch them do it. But Marcus wasn't finished. There's something else. Heritage Wealth Transitions has been under federal investigation for 18 months. The FBI has been building a case against them for running what amounts to a legalized elder abuse operation. Your children's case might be exactly what they need to bring charges against the whole organization. That afternoon, I found myself in a situation I'd never imagined, sitting in a federal building in Tampa, explaining to FBI agents how my own children had tried to steal my life savings with professional help. Agent Rebecca Martinez was lead investigator on the Heritage Wealth Transitions case, and she explained that my situation was both typical and valuable to their investigation. We've been tracking this organization for over a year, but most of their victims don't realize they're being victimized until it's too late. Your case is unusual because you recognized the manipulation early and documented the evidence. Agent Martinez showed me files on dozens of other families where Heritage Wealth Transitions had provided consultation services. The pattern was always the same: identify elderly individuals with assets and strained family relationships, then provide the adult children with a roadmap for gaining legal control while maintaining plausible cover. In most cases, by the time we get involved, the assets have been transferred, the elderly person has been placed in care, and the adult children have legal documentation supporting their actions. Your case is different because you stopped the process before they could complete it. I asked what would happen to my children if they cooperated with the federal investigation. Agent Martinez was frank about the reality. If they provide information about Heritage Wealth Transitions and testify about the services they received, we might be able to work with the district attorney to reduce their charges. But they're still looking at serious consequences for what they attempted to do to you. And if they don't cooperate, then they'll face the full weight of both the state charges and any federal charges that might apply. Conspiracy to commit financial fraud across state lines is a federal crime, especially when it involves targeting elderly victims. That evening, I called Patricia to discuss the implications of everything I'd learned. The criminal case against my children was now connected to a federal investigation that could result in much more serious consequences than I'd originally intended. Lisa, this has gotten bigger than family justice. Your children are potentially looking at federal prison time if they're convicted on all charges. Do you think I should back down? I think you need to decide whether you want justice or revenge, because at this point, you might get both whether you want them or not. That night, I sat in my sterile assisted living apartment and thought about what my children's futures looked like. Michael could face up to 10 years in federal prison for the forgery and fraud charges. Sarah could face 5 years for conspiracy and accessory charges. Emma could face 3 years for her role in documenting false information about my mental state. These were my children. I'd raised them, loved them, supported them through every crisis and disappointment they'd faced. And now I was potentially sending them to federal prison for trying to steal from me. But then I remembered Christmas Eve. I remembered standing on that platform at Penn Station, watching them drive away after abandoning me, like I was nothing more than an inconvenient problem they'd finally solved. I remembered the intake forms where they'd lied about my mental health to justify their action. I remembered Michael's forged signature on documents that would have given him control over my life savings. They hadn't just made a mistake or acted impulsively. They'd planned, researched, and executed a sophisticated scheme to rob me while convincing themselves they were acting in my best interests. They'd been willing to destroy my autonomy, my dignity, and my financial security to solve their own problem. The next morning, I made a decision that would determine the rest of my children's lives. I called Agent Martinez and told her I was willing to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. I would provide all my documentation, testify about my children's actions, and help build the case against Heritage Wealth Transitions. But I also called Patricia and asked her to reach out to my children with an offer they probably wouldn't expect. I want you to tell them that I'm willing to consider a plea arrangement, but only if they meet specific conditions. What kind of conditions? They need to provide complete cooperation with both the state and federal investigation. They need to testify against Heritage Wealth Transitions and provide all documentation of their consultations with that organization. They need to publicly acknowledge what they did and take responsibility for their actions. And in exchange, I'll advocate for reduced sentences, and I'll agree to supervised restitution instead of imprisonment, provided they complete financial responsibility education and perform significant community service related to elder abuse prevention. It wasn't mercy, it was education through consequences that might actually teach them something valuable instead of just destroying their lives. Patricia agreed to present the offer, but she warned me that my children might not be in a position to refuse even if they wanted to. Lisa, when they realize the scope of what they're facing, they may not have any choice but to cooperate. The federal charges alone could result in decades in prison if they're convicted on all counts. The response came faster than I'd expected. Within 24 hours, all three of my children had agreed to cooperate fully with both investigations, but their agreement came with a request for a face-to-face meeting to discuss the terms of their cooperation. I agreed to meet them in Patricia's office in New York. It would be the first time I'd seen them since Christmas Eve, and I wasn't sure what to expect from people who'd spent the past month discovering that their attempt to control my life had resulted in them losing control of their own. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in mid-February. I flew from Florida to New York, stayed overnight in a hotel near Patricia's office, and spent the morning preparing myself to see the children who'd tried to steal my future. They looked different when they walked into the conference room. Michael had lost weight and seemed to have aged years in the 6 weeks since I'd seen him. Sarah was professionally dressed but couldn't hide the stress lines around her eyes or the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. Emma looked like she'd been crying for weeks, which she probably had, but what struck me most was how small they seemed. For months they'd seemed so confident, so certain they knew what was best for me and for them. Now they looked like what they actually were, young adults who'd made catastrophically bad decisions and were finally facing the consequences. Michael spoke first, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, we know what we did was wrong. We know we hurt you, and we know we betrayed your trust. We want to make it right." "How do you plan to make it right?" Sarah pulled out a folder thick with documents. "We've prepared a complete disclosure of everything we did, everyone we talked to, and every service we received from Heritage Wealth Transition. We're willing to testify against them and provide whatever evidence the investigators need. We've also prepared personal statements acknowledging our actions and taking full responsibility." Emma added, "We know that what we did was elder abuse, and we want to help make sure other families don't go through what we put you through." I looked at these three people who'd once been the center of my world, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Sad, not for what they'd tried to do to me, but for what they'd done to themselves. They'd destroyed their relationship with their mother, compromised their own integrity, and committed crimes that would follow them for the rest of their lives. All for money they could have simply asked for. I asked, "Why didn't you just talk to me about your financial problems? Why didn't you ask for help instead of trying to take control?" The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Sarah answered with an honesty that surprised me. "Because we were ashamed. We were ashamed that we needed so much help, ashamed that we couldn't support ourselves, ashamed that we'd become so dependent on you that we couldn't imagine our lives without your financial support. So you decided to take control instead of asking for it. We decided to solve the problem permanently," Michael said. "We thought if we could gain access to your assets, we could use them responsibly and you'd never have to worry about us again. And the assisted living facility, we convinced ourselves you'd be happier there, Emma said, tears starting again. We told ourselves we were protecting you from the stress of managing everything alone. But really, you were protecting yourselves from having to ask permission to spend my money. They all nodded, and the shame on their faces was genuine. They'd finally understood that their elaborate justifications had been nothing more than sophisticated ways of lying to themselves about their motivations. Patricia outlined the terms of the cooperation agreement. My children would provide complete testimony about Heritage Wealth transitions, surrender all documents related to their consultations, and submit to financial monitoring to ensure they weren't hiding any assets they'd already obtained fraudulently. In exchange, the state charges would be reduced to misdemeanors with supervised probation, restitution, and community service. The federal charges would be dropped if their cooperation resulted in successful prosecution of Heritage Wealth transition. But I had additional conditions that weren't part of the legal agreement. I want each of you to complete a year-long financial literacy program and demonstrate that you can support yourselves without family assistance. I want you to volunteer at organizations that help elderly victims of financial abuse, and I want you to understand that our relationship is not going back to the way it was before. What do you mean? Emma asked. I mean, that I'm not your emergency fund anymore. I'm not your backup plan when your own choices don't work out. I'm not your insurance policy against the consequences of poor financial decisions. But you're still our mother, Michael said. I'm still your mother, but I'm not your. Those are two different relationships, and you need to learn the difference. The meeting ended with signed agreements, exchanged documents, and awkward attempts at reconciliation that couldn't bridge the gap between who they'd been to me before and who they'd proven themselves to be. Over the next 6 months, I watched from a distance as my children learned to live within their means for the first time in their adult lives. Michael found steady work as a customer service representative and moved to a modest apartment he could afford on his own salary. Sarah rebuilt her marketing career on a smaller scale, focusing on local clients and realistic budgets. Emma transferred to a state university, took out student loans, and got a part-time job to cover her living expenses. Their lives were smaller, more constrained, and undoubtedly more stressful than they'd been when I was subsidizing their lifestyle choices. But they were also more honest, more sustainable, and more genuinely there. The federal case against Heritage Wealth Transitions went to trial in September, and my children testified about the services they'd received and the advice they'd been given. Their testimony was crucial in establishing the organization's pattern of targeting elderly individuals and providing families with sophisticated tools for financial exploitation. Heritage Wealth Transitions was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. The organization was shut down, its assets were seized, and its principals were sentenced to significant prison terms. My children's cooperation with the investigation resulted in their charges being reduced as promised, but the experience of going through the legal system, testifying about their own crimes, and facing the possibility of federal prison had changed them in ways that simple financial consequences couldn't have achieved. As winter approached, nearly a year after they'd abandoned me at Penn Station, I moved back to New York. Not to my old house in Westchester, which I'd sold to establish a foundation for elder abuse prevention, but to a smaller place in the city, where I could build a life that belonged entirely to me. My children and I maintained contact, but it was different. They called regularly, but they didn't call asking for money. They visited, but they didn't visit expecting me to solve their problems. They expressed interest in my life and my well-being, but they didn't frame that interest in terms of what I could do for them. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before, and it wasn't the relationship I'd once wanted us to have, but it was honest, and it was based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The most surprising development was how much happier they seemed once they'd learned to support themselves. The constant stress of managing financial crises they couldn't afford, maintaining lifestyles they hadn't earned, and pretending to be more successful than they actually were, had been replaced by the satisfaction of genuine achievement and authentic independence. They'd learned that security built on someone else's sacrifice isn't security at all,
and that self-respect can't be purchased with borrowed money. They'd discovered that being honest about their limitations was less shameful than lying about their capabilities, and that earning things for themselves was more satisfying than being given things they hadn't deserved. But the most important lesson they'd learned was that treating family relationships like business transactions destroys both the relationship and the transaction. Love can't be bought, respect can't be inherited, and support that comes with the expectation of exploitation isn't support at all, it's just a more sophisticated form of abuse. They'd tried to steal my future to fund their present, but instead, they'd been forced to build a future that actually belonged to them. And in losing access to my money, they'd gained something much more valuable: the ability to look at themselves in the mirror and know that whatever they had, they'd earned honestly. 2 years after that Christmas Eve abandonment at Penn Station, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined. I was sitting in my new apartment, overlooking Central Park, reading a letter from the Department of Justice, thanking me for my contribution to the largest elder financial abuse prosecution in federal history. But the letter wasn't what made me smile. What made me smile was the text message from Emma that had arrived that morning. "Mom, I just got promoted to supervisor at the nonprofit. They said I have real leadership potential. Want to celebrate with dinner this weekend." 2 years ago, Emma had never paid for her own meal, let alone offered to take me out to celebrate her achievements. The transformation in all 3 of my children had been remarkable, but Emma's journey had been the most dramatic because she'd had the furthest to fall. After the plea agreements were finalized and the criminal cases concluded, Emma had been forced to confront the reality that at 28 years old, she'd never actually accomplished anything on her own. Her education had been funded by me, her living expenses covered by me, even her art supplies and therapy sessions paid for by me. When all that support disappeared, she'd been forced to discover who she actually was beneath the entitled graduate student persona she'd been performing. The discovery process had been brutal but ultimately transformative. Emma had enrolled at a state university where she qualified for need-based financial aid, taken out student loans for the first time in her life, and gotten a job at a nonprofit organization that provided services to elderly victims of financial abuse. The irony of that last part wasn't lost on any of us. At first, she'd taken the nonprofit job because it was required community service related to her plea agreement, but something unexpected had happened during her first month there. She'd met Rosa Martinez, an 84-year-old woman whose grandson had stolen her Social Security checks and left her unable to pay rent. Emma had helped Rosa navigate the bureaucracy to get her benefits restored and find temporary housing, and for the first time in her life, she'd experienced the satisfaction of solving someone else's problems instead of creating them. "I never realized how good it feels to actually help people," she'd told me during one of our carefully structured monthly phone calls. "I spent so many years focused on my own problems that I never understood how much perspective you get from seeing what other people are dealing with." The monthly phone calls had been Patricia's suggestion. After the legal proceedings concluded, my children and I needed structure for rebuilding any kind of relationship. The old dynamic of unlimited access and constant crisis management was gone forever, but that didn't mean we couldn't develop something healthier in its place. The calls had started awkwardly, with all of us unsure how to interact when money wasn't the underlying subtext of every conversation. But gradually they'd evolved into something that felt more genuine than anything we'd shared during the years when I was funding their lifestyles. Michael had surprised me the most with his capacity for honest self-reflection. 6 months after his plea agreement, he'd called during one of our scheduled conversations with news that I'd never expected to hear. "Mom, I've been going to therapy to figure out why I made such destructive choices, and my therapist helped me understand something important. I think I was so afraid of disappointing you that I convinced myself lying was better than admitting I was struggling." "What do you mean?" "I mean that every time I failed at something or needed help, I felt like I was proving that all the money you'd invested in me was wasted. So instead of being honest about my problems, I created bigger problems to distract from the original ones." Michael's insight had been profound because it explained so much about the escalating pattern of his financial crises. Each business failure had led to larger requests for funding, Each career setback had resulted in more elaborate explanations about why he needed support, until eventually he'd been so deep in a hole of his own creation that stealing my house had seemed like a reasonable solution. I realize now that I was treating you like an investment that needed to produce returns instead of a person who deserved honesty about what was actually happening in my life. The therapy had been Michael's idea, paid for with his own money, earned from the customer service job he'd initially taken just to meet his probation requirement. But the job had taught him something valuable about the connection between effort and reward, and he'd been promoted twice in 18 months, based on his actual performance, rather than his family connections or financial backing. "I'm never going to be rich," he'd told me during our most recent conversation, "but I'm going to be honest, and I'm learning that honest feels a lot better than rich ever did." Sarah's transformation had been more gradual but equally significant. She'd always been the most financially sophisticated of my children, which had made her role in the conspiracy particularly painful. She'd used her business acumen and legal knowledge to orchestrate much of the planning, and she'd been the one who'd researched the most effective ways to gain control of my assets, but her business skills, when redirected toward legitimate purposes, had proven quite valuable. She'd rebuilt her marketing consultancy on a much smaller scale, focusing on local nonprofits and small businesses that needed affordable services. Her income was lower than it had been when I was subsidizing her lifestyle, but it was steady, predictable, and entirely her own. More importantly, she'd developed expertise in financial literacy education, and had begun volunteering to teach budgeting and financial planning classes to young adults.
Her firsthand experience with the consequences of financial irresponsibility had made her an unexpectedly effective educator. "I tell my students that the most expensive thing you can buy is something you can't afford," she'd explained to me. "And the most dangerous person to borrow from is someone who loves you, because you'll convince yourself that exploiting their love is somehow different from stealing their money." Sarah's volunteer work had connected her with other families who'd dealt with financial abuse situations, and she'd become an advocate for stronger legal protections for elderly people and better education about family financial dynamics. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that my children had become experts in preventing exactly the kind of behavior they'd once engaged in, but their transformation from perpetrators to advocates had been genuine, driven by their firsthand understanding of how financial manipulation destroys families and hurts the people who are supposed to matter most. The broader impact of our case had exceeded anything I'd imagined when I first decided to fight back against my children's betrayal. The prosecution of Heritage Wealth Transitions had exposed a nationwide network of companies that specialized in helping families exploit elderly relatives, and the resulting investigations had led to additional cases in 12 states. Agent Martinez had kept me updated on the broader implications of the case, and the numbers were staggering. Heritage Wealth Transitions alone had been involved in schemes that had stolen over $40 million from elderly victims across the country. The organization had provided services to hundreds of families who wanted to gain control of their parents' assets without the inconvenience of waiting for natural death or honest inheritance. "Your case was the key that unlocked everything," Agent Martinez had told me when the final convictions were announced. "Without your evidence and your children's testimony, we never would have been able to establish the scope of the conspiracy or the sophistication of their method." The success of the prosecution had led to federal legislation strengthening penalties for family-based financial abuse and requiring better oversight of companies that provided asset management services for elderly individuals. The law had been informally dubbed the Brown Family Protection Act, though I'd requested that my name not be used in the official title. But the legal victories and policy changes, while satisfying, weren't what had given me the most meaningful sense of resolution. What had healed me was watching my children learn to build lives based on their own efforts and achievements, rather than my financial support. The process hadn't been smooth or quick. There had been setbacks, arguments, and moments when I'd wondered if our family relationships could survive the complete restructuring they'd required. Michael had struggled with depression during his first year of financial independence. Sarah had experienced panic attacks when she'd realized how much debt she'd accumulated while living beyond her means. Emma had gone through a period of anger where she'd blamed me for not teaching her financial responsibility earlier, but they'd worked through their difficulties without asking me to solve them, and they'd developed coping skills and support systems that didn't depend on my intervention. They'd learned to distinguish between asking for advice and demanding rescue, between sharing their struggles and expecting me to fix them. Most importantly, they'd learned to value our relationship for what it was, rather than what it could provide them. Our conversations had become more honest, more reciprocal, and more genuinely caring. They asked about my life, my interests, my plans, and my feelings without trying to steer those conversations toward their own needs or problems. The monthly dinners we'd started having 6 months ago were nothing like the family gatherings we'd had before their betrayal, but they were something better. They were authentic. We talked about books, current events, their work experiences, my volunteer activities, and shared memories that didn't involve money or crisis management. Emma had been right when she'd said I was training them in financial loss, but the training had been more comprehensive than she'd understood. I'd taught them that financial security couldn't be built on someone else's sacrifice, that self-respect required self-sufficiency, and that family love was something you earned through behavior rather than inherited through biology. The assisted living facility in Florida had provided an unexpected benefit during my temporary stay there. I'd met other residents who'd been warehoused by their families for various reasons, and I'd learned that my situation, while painful, was far from unique. Many elderly people found themselves isolated from families who saw them primarily as sources of money or inconvenient responsibilities. But I'd also met residents who'd developed rich, independent lives after being forced to rebuild their sense of identity and purpose. Margaret Chen, my neighbor in the facility, had been placed there by adult children who'd wanted to sell her house to fund their own business venture. Instead of accepting the situation, she'd fought back legally, regained control of her assets, and eventually moved to a retirement community that she'd chosen for herself. The best thing that ever happened to me was learning that I didn't need my children's approval to live my own life, Margaret had told me. Once I stopped trying to make them happy and started focusing on making myself happy, everything got better. Margaret's friendship had been invaluable during those early months when I was questioning whether I'd been too harsh in my response to my children's betrayal. She'd helped me understand that protecting myself from financial abuse wasn't cruelty, it was survival, and that teaching my children to be independent wasn't punishment, it was preparation for the real world. We'd stayed in touch after I'd moved back to New York, and Margaret had become one of my closest friends. She'd also become involved in the Elder Abuse Prevention Foundation I'd established with the proceeds from selling my Westchester house. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. What had started as a way to channel my anger into something constructive had evolved into a comprehensive resource for elderly people dealing with financial abuse and families struggling with unhealthy financial dynamics. We provided legal advocacy for elderly victims, financial literacy education for families, and support groups for people who'd experienced betrayal by relatives. We also funded research into the psychological and social factors that led to elder financial abuse, and we worked with lawmakers to strengthen legal protection. The foundation had given me a sense of purpose that was more fulfilling than anything I'd experienced during my years as a traditional mother and financial advisor. Instead of managing other people's problems, I was helping to solve systemic issues that affected thousands of families. Instead of enabling dependence, I was promoting independence and self-advocacy. My children had all become involved with the foundation in various capacities, but as volunteers rather than beneficiaries. Michael helped with outreach to families who were dealing with financial abuse situations. Sarah provided financial literacy education and helped develop educational materials. Emma worked directly with elderly victims, using her experience at the nonprofit to provide emotional support and practical assistance. Their involvement wasn't required by their plea agreements or mandated by any legal obligations. They'd chosen to participate because they'd genuinely learned from their experiences and wanted to help prevent other families from going through what we'd endured. The foundation work had also provided a context for our family relationships that was healthier than anything we'd had before. Instead of being connected primarily through financial dependency, we were connected through shared values and common goals. We worked together on projects that mattered to all of us, and we supported each other's contributions without expectation of personal benefit. Last month, the foundation had received a significant grant to expand our educational programs into schools and universities. The idea was to teach young adults about healthy family financial dynamics before they developed problematic patterns of dependence or exploitation. Emma had been particularly excited about the educational program because she'd realized that her own financial irresponsibility had been partly the result of never learning basic money management skills or understanding the connection between effort and reward. I think a lot of young people assume that financial support from family is automatic and unlimited. She'd said during our planning meeting, nobody teaches you that support is a gift that comes with responsibilities, or that taking advantage of someone's love is actually a form of abuse. The educational program would include modules on financial independence, family boundaries, elder abuse prevention, and the psychological factors that led to financial exploitation. We'd also developed case studies based on real situations, including our own, to help students understand the real-world consequences of financial irresponsibility and family manipulation. As I sat in my apartment that evening, reflecting on everything that had happened since that Christmas Eve abandonment, I realized that my children's betrayal had ultimately led to the most meaningful and authentic relationships we'd ever had. They'd tried to steal my future to fund their present, but in failing to do so, they'd been forced to build futures that actually belonged to them. They'd lost access to my money, but they'd gained self-respect, independence, and the satisfaction of genuine achievement. I'd lost the illusion that unconditional financial support was the same thing as unconditional love, but I'd gained children who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide them. The family we'd become was smaller, more honest, and more sustainable than the family we'd been. We were connected by choice rather than obligation, by mutual respect rather than financial dependence, and by shared values rather than shared resources. My children had learned that security built on someone else's sacrifice isn't security at all, and that relationships based on exploitation eventually consume themselves. They'd discovered that earning things for themselves was more satisfying than being given things they hadn't deserved, and that honesty about limitations was less shameful than lying about capability. But most importantly, they'd learned that treating family relationships like business transactions destroys both the relationship and the transaction. Love can't be bought, respect can't be inherited, and support that comes with the expectation of exploitation isn't support at all. 2 years ago, my children had seen me as a problem that needed to be managed, and an asset that needed to be liquidated. Today, they saw me as a person they respected, and a family member they'd earned the right to love honestly. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick, but it had been complete. My children had learned the most expensive lesson of their lives, and it had turned out to be the most valuable education they'd ever received. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about Emma's promotion and her offer to take me to dinner to celebrate. 2 years ago, she'd been a 28-year-old graduate student who'd never paid for her own meal. Today, she was a supervisor at a nonprofit organization who was proud to treat her mother to celebrate her own achievements. That transformation, multiplied across all 3 of my children, was worth more than any financial inheritance I could have left them. I'd given them something much more valuable than money. I'd given them the ability to build lives they could be proud of, relationships they could trust, and futures they'd earned honestly. My children had tried to train me in financial loss by stealing my assets and controlling my life. Instead, I'd trained them in something much more important. I'd taught them the difference between taking and earning, between dependency and independence, between exploitation and love, and in learning those lessons, they'd become the kind of people I could actually be proud to call my children. 3 years had passed since that transformative Christmas Eve, and I was standing in the ballroom of the Marriott in downtown Manhattan, surrounded by over 300 people who had gathered for the 3rd annual Elder Financial Protection Conference. The foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations, and this conference had become the premier national event for professionals working in elder abuse prevention. But tonight wasn't about statistics or policy victory. Tonight was personal, because my children were scheduled to speak publicly about their experiences for the first time since the criminal proceedings had concluded. I watched from the wings as Emma took the stage first. She was wearing a professional navy dress I'd never seen before, one she'd obviously purchased with her own money, and she carried herself with a confidence that was entirely different from the entitled graduate student persona she'd once performed. "My name is Emma Brown," she began, her voice steady despite what I knew was considerable nervousness. "3 years ago I participated in a conspiracy to steal my mother's life savings and commit her to assisted living against her will. I'm here tonight to tell you exactly how we did it, why we thought we could get away with it, and what happened when we discovered that our mother was much stronger and smarter than we'd given her credit for." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Emma had insisted on speaking without notes, wanting her presentation to be as honest and spontaneous as possible. She'd prepared by sharing her story dozens of times with smaller groups, but this was her first time addressing a national audience of law enforcement officials, social workers, attorneys, and other professionals who dealt with elder abuse cases. "The thing about financial abuse within families is that it doesn't start with a decision to steal," Emma continued. "It starts with a sense of entitlement that builds so gradually you don't even notice it happening. For years my mother supported me financially while I pursued my education and my artistic interests. She paid my tuition, my living expenses, my therapy bills, even my art supply. And somewhere along the way I stopped thinking of that support as generosity and started thinking of it as something I was owed." Emma explained how that sense of entitlement had evolved into resentment when I'd begun suggesting they needed to become more financially independent. She described the family meetings where they'd convinced themselves that controlling my assets was actually protecting me, and how they'd used professional consultation services to develop their strategy. "We told ourselves we were being responsible and caring children who were looking out for our mother's best interests," she said, "but the truth is, we were scared. We were scared of having to support ourselves, scared of losing our comfortable lifestyles, and scared of facing the reality that we'd become adults who were completely dependent on our elderly mother." The audience was captivated by Emma's honesty about the psychological progression from dependence to exploitation. She explained how heritage wealth transitions had provided them with sophisticated justifications for their actions, framing their financial abuse as proactive asset protection and preventive care planning. "The consultant told us that elderly people often resist necessary care transitions, and that families sometimes needed to make difficult decisions for their parents' own protection. They gave us templates for documenting mental health concerns, sample language for care facility applications, and advice on how to structure asset transfers to minimize legal complications." Emma's presentation was devastating in its clarity about how easily professional services could be manipulated to facilitate family-based financial abuse. She described the intake forms they'd filled out describing my supposed cognitive decline, the forged documents Michael had used to try to secure loans against my property, and the systematic way they'd planned to liquidate my assets once they'd gained legal control. But the most powerful part of Emma's speech was her description of the consequences they'd faced, and the lessons they'd learned. "When our scheme collapsed, we didn't just lose access to our mother's money, we lost our relationship with her, our respect for ourselves, and our ability to look in the mirror without feeling ashamed. We faced criminal charges, federal investigation, and the possibility of spending years in prison. But the worst consequence was realizing that we'd become the kind of people who would steal from someone who loved us." Emma concluded by describing her current work with elderly abuse victims, and her transformation from perpetrator to advocate. She talked about the satisfaction of earning her own living, the pride of genuine achievement, and the relief of building a relationship with me that was based on mutual respect rather than financial exploitation. "I can't undo what I did to my mother, but I can use that experience to help other families avoid making the same mistakes. I can teach young people about the difference between family support and family exploitation. And I can tell elderly people that they have the right to protect themselves from their own children if necessary." The applause when Emma finished was sustained and genuine. Several people in the audience were crying, and I could see others taking notes furiously, recognizing the value of hearing the perpetrator's perspective on how financial abuse develops and how it can be prevented. Michael spoke next,
and his presentation focused on the business and legal aspects of their conspiracy. He explained how they'd researched elder law, explored inheritance acceleration options, and worked with heritage wealth transitions to develop what they'd believed was a legally defensible plan for gaining control of my assets. We weren't operating in an information vacuum, Michael said. We had professional guidance, legal templates, and what we thought was expert advice about how to protect elderly parents from their own poor judgment. The problem wasn't that we didn't know what we were doing. The problem was that what we were doing was fundamentally wrong, regardless of how sophisticated our methods were. Michael described the loan application process where he'd forged my signature, explaining how easy it had been to find online resources about power of attorney documents and asset verification procedure. He talked about the business plan he'd developed for accessing my estate funds and how he'd convinced himself that managing my money more efficiently would benefit everyone involved. I told myself I was being a responsible son who was preventing my mother from making poor financial decisions. But the truth is, I was being a thief who was using family relationships to justify stealing. The fact that I had sophisticated methods and professional consultation didn't change the fundamental nature of what I was attempting to do. Michael's presentation was particularly valuable for the law enforcement officials in the audience, because he provided detailed information about how financial abuse conspiracies are structured and how families use legitimate-seeming documentation to cover fraudulent activity. Sarah spoke last, and her presentation focused on the broader systemic issues that enabled family-based financial abuse. As the most business-savvy of my children, she'd been responsible for much of the strategic planning, and she had insights into how the system could be reformed to better protect elderly people. Elder financial abuse is a growth industry, Sarah said bluntly. There are companies that specialize in helping families gain control of elderly relatives' assets, and they market their services as legitimate care planning and asset protection. These companies operate in legal gray areas, providing services that look professional and sound reasonable but are actually designed to facilitate exploitation. Sarah explained how Heritage Wealth Transitions had connected them with other service providers, including attorneys who specialized in competency proceeding, financial advisors who could help families access estate funds early, and care facilities that were willing to accept residents based on family representations rather than independent medical evaluation. We weren't just three greedy adult children who decided to steal from our mother. We were clients of an entire industry that profits from helping families exploit elderly relatives while maintaining plausible legal cover. Sarah's presentation included specific recommendations for regulatory changes that could make family-based financial abuse more difficult to execute and easier to detect. She proposed stronger oversight of companies that provided elder care consulting services, mandatory independent evaluation for competency proceedings initiated by family members, and better training for financial institutions about recognizing signs of elder abuse. But like Emma and Michael, Sarah spent significant time discussing the personal transformation she'd undergone as a result of facing consequences for her actions. Learning to support myself financially was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most important. For the first time in my adult life, I had to take responsibility for my own choices and live with the consequences of my own decisions. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. After all three presentations concluded, there was a panel discussion where my children answered questions from the audience. The questions were tough and sometimes hostile, particularly from social workers and victim advocates who dealt with the aftermath of elder abuse cases. One social worker asked Emma how she could justify working with elderly abuse victims given her own history as a perpetrator. Emma's answer was thoughtful and honest. "I can't justify it," she said, "but I can explain why it's valuable. I understand the mindset that leads to financial abuse because I lived it. I know the justifications perpetrators use because I used them myself, and I know what consequences actually change behavior because I experienced them personally. That perspective is useful for prevention education, even if it doesn't excuse what I did." A law enforcement official asked Michael whether he thought criminal prosecution was necessary for cases like theirs. or whether civil remedies would be sufficient to deter family-based financial abuse. Criminal prosecution was absolutely necessary in our case, Michael replied. Civil remedies wouldn't have been sufficient because we didn't think we were doing anything wrong. We thought we were being responsible and caring children. It took the threat of federal prison to make us understand that our actions constituted serious crimes. The most challenging question came from an elderly woman in the audience, who identified herself as a financial abuse survivor. She asked Sarah how families could rebuild trust after one family member had betrayed another's financial security. "I don't think trust can be rebuilt," Sarah answered honestly. "I think you have to build something new that's based on different foundations. My relationship with my mother now is healthier than it was before, but it's not the same relationship we had when she was financially supporting us. We had to learn to value each other for different reasons." As I listened to my children answer these difficult questions with honesty and humility, I felt something I hadn't expected: pride. Not pride in what they'd done, but pride in who they'd become as a result of facing consequences for their actions. They'd learned that accountability wasn't punishment, it was education. They'd discovered that taking responsibility for harm you'd caused was the first step toward becoming someone who wouldn't cause that harm again. And they'd proven that people could change when they were forced to confront the real consequences of their choices. The conference concluded with a reception where attendees could continue conversations and network with colleagues from around the country. I watched my children interact with social workers, attorneys, and victim advocates, answering additional questions about their experiences and providing insights that could help protect other families. They were no longer the entitled, financially dependent adults who'd tried to steal my life savings. They'd become knowledgeable advocates who understood both sides of elder abuse situations and could provide valuable perspectives for prevention and intervention efforts. But more importantly to me personally, they'd become people I could respect and trust, not because they'd never betrayed me, but because they'd learned from their betrayal and worked to ensure they'd never repeat it. As the evening wound down, we gathered in the hotel lobby for a few minutes before going our separate ways. It was the first time we'd been together publicly, as a family, since the criminal proceedings had concluded, and the experience had been both challenging and healing. "Thank you for letting us do this," Emma said. "I know it wasn't easy for you to hear us talk about what we did to you in front of all those people." "It wasn't easy," I agreed, "but it was important. Your perspectives are valuable for preventing other families from going through what we went through." "Do you think we helped anyone tonight?" Michael asked. "I think you helped everyone who was in that room understand that financial abuse isn't just about greed or evil people taking advantage of innocent victims. It's about how normal family dynamics can become toxic when financial dependence replaces emotional connection." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I hope we can continue doing this kind of education. I think there are a lot of families out there who are heading down the same path we went down, and maybe hearing our story could help them change course before it's too late." As I said goodbye to my children that night, I reflected on how completely our family dynamics had changed. 3 years ago, they'd seen me as an obstacle to overcome and an asset to liquidate. Tonight, they'd seen me as a partner in important work and a family member they were proud to stand beside. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy, but it had been complete. My children had learned that respect couldn't be inherited, and support couldn't be demanded. They'd discovered that genuine achievement was more satisfying than unearned benefits, and that honest relationships were more valuable than financially advantageous ones. They'd tried to steal my future, but instead they'd been forced to build futures they could actually be proud of. And in the process, we'd all learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when that person is your own child. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.